Oakhollow, Washington, November 14, 1986. The rain fell in sheets across Oakhollow that Friday evening, drumming against rooftops and transforming the streets into glossy black mirrors. Headlights from passing cars refracted through the downpour, creating halos of yellow light that briefly illuminated the town's storefronts before fading back into the early darkness of a Pacific Northwest autumn. It was the kind of rain that locals barely acknowledged a constant companion from October through April, but visitors found oppressive, almost sentient in its persistence. Detective Elias Harmon, warming his hands around a cup of coffee at the window of Maggie's diner, watched the deluge with practiced indifference. The weather matched his mood, gray, relentless, and growing darker by the minute. More coffee, detective? Maggie herself stood beside his booth, coffee pot in hand, her expression betraying the concern she tried to mask with professional courtesy. No thanks, Maggie. I should head out soon. He checked his watch. 5:41 p.m. The Kessler children would be reported missing in exactly 19 minutes. Of course, he didn't know that yet. Nobody did. At that very moment, Eleanor Kessler was pacing her kitchen floor, phone pressed to her ear, as she tried for the 7th time to reach her oldest son, Thaddeus. 17-year-old Thad had promised to bring his siblings, 15-year-old Linnea, 13-year-old Quentin, and 9-year-old Wren, home directly after school. They should have arrived 3 hours ago. They are probably just at the library, her husband Marcus suggested from behind his newspaper. You know how Thad gets when he's helping the others with homework. Eleanor hung up the phone, her fingers lingering on the receiver. The library closed at 5. I called 20 minutes ago. The worry had started as a small seed planted when the clock struck 3:30 with no sign of her children. By 4:30 she'd called the school. By 4:30 she'd called every friend she could think of. By 5:00 the seed had grown into a strangling vine of dread that tightened around her chest with each passing minute. I'm calling the police, she announced, her voice cracking as she reached again for the phone. Marcus lowered his newspaper, finally registering his wife's distress. Eleanor, don't you think you are overreacting? They are probably just... The phone rang, cutting him off mid-sentence. Eleanor snatched it up. Hello? Thad? The voice on the other end wasn't Thad's. It was Sheriff Roy Dalton, calling to ask if the Kessler children were home yet. A blue 1978 Chevrolet Impala, the same model and color as the car Thad drove, had been found abandoned on Pinecrest Road, about 7 miles outside of town near the entrance to Whispering Pines State Forest. The car was empty, Sheriff Dalton explained, his voice carefully neutral. Door was open, keys still in the ignition. Might be nothing, but with this weather I thought I'd check if your kids made it home all right. They hadn't, and they never would. The search began immediately. Despite the rain, nearly half the town's population gathered at the sheriff's station, ready to comb the forest. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness as volunteers called out the names of the 4 Kessler children. The rain washed away footprints, scents, and hope with equal efficiency. Detective Harmon, officially off duty but unable to stay home when 4 children were missing, stood beside Sheriff Dalton as they examined a map spread across the hood of a patrol car, protected from the rain by a hastily erected tarp. The car was found here. Dalton pointed to a spot on the map where Pinecrest Road curved sharply before straightening out again. No skid marks, no sign of an accident, just abandoned. What's a teenager doing out on Pinecrest Road after school anyway? Harmon asked, voicing the question that had been bothering him since he'd heard the location. That's not on the way home from Oakhollow High. According to the parents, Thad sometimes took the long way home if the weather was nice. The kids liked to stop at Thompson's convenience store for candy. Dalton gestured vaguely toward another point on the map. But in this weather, I can't imagine why they'd take that route today. Harmon frowned, studying the map more closely. What about the construction on Maple Avenue? Would they have needed to detour? Dalton shook his head. Construction finished last week. Road's been clear. So we have 4 kids in a car. taking an unusual route home in terrible weather, who apparently stopped, left the car with the keys in the ignition, and, decided to go for a walk in the forest during a downpour. Both men fell silent, contemplating the implications. There were no good explanations. By midnight, the search had yielded nothing. No footprints, no personal belongings, no sign of the Kessler children anywhere in the vicinity of the abandoned car. The rain had finally stopped, but a thick fog had rolled in, limiting visibility and forcing many of the volunteers to return home, exhausted and disheartened. Eleanor and Marcus Kessler sat huddled together in the back of an ambulance, shock blankets wrapped around their shoulders, staring blankly into the mist. They had insisted on joining the search despite the sheriff's advice to stay home by the phone. Now they looked hollowed out, as if the fog had seeped into them and dissolved something essential. "Mr. and Mrs. Kessler?" Detective Harmon approached them cautiously. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you a few more questions." Eleanor nodded mechanically. Marcus didn't respond at all, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. "Had any of your children mentioned any problems lately? Anyone bothering them at school? Any unusual behavior?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, nothing like that. They are good kids. Thad is responsible. He's never been in any trouble. He takes care of his siblings." "What about friends? Any new people in their lives?" "Thad has his basketball teammates. Linnea has her art club friends. Quentin mostly keeps to himself, reads a lot. Wren is friends with everyone." Eleanor's voice broke on her youngest child's name. "They are normal kids. Detective, they should be home right now." Harmon nodded sympathetically. "And you said they were all together after school?" "That was the plan." "Yes," Marcus finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Thad always picks up the younger ones on Fridays. Linnea from the high school, Quentin from the middle school, and Wren from elementary. They ride home together. It's our routine." "And they all would have been in the car by what time?" "Around 3 hours," Eleanor supplied. "Thad texted me." She stopped abruptly, eyes widening. "Thad's phone. Have you checked their phones?" Harmon exchanged a glance with Sheriff Dalton, who had joined them. "Mrs. Kessler, we haven't found any phones. Were they all carrying them?" "Thad and Linnea have phones. The younger ones don't. But Thad always keeps his phone with him. He's very responsible that way." Harmon made a note. "We will try tracing the phones right away. This might give us something to work with." As he walked away, Harmon heard Eleanor whisper to her husband, "They are alive, Marcus. I'd know if they weren't. A mother would know." Harmon wished he could believe that was true. November 15th, 1986, 8:17 a.m. The morning brought no relief. The fog had thickened overnight, transforming Whispering Pines State Forest into a ghostly landscape of half-visible trees and muffled sounds. The search resumed at dawn, with fresh volunteers replacing those who had searched through the night. But spirits were low. Everyone knew that with each passing hour, the chances of finding the Kessler children alive diminished. Detective Harmon stood in the mobile command center that had been set up near where Thad's car had been found, reviewing the meager evidence they had gathered so far. The car itself had yielded little. No blood, no signs of struggle. 4 backpacks in the trunk, containing typical school materials. A half-eaten package of red vines in the center console. A mixtape labeled Lizzie's Jams in the cassette player. Nothing to indicate why they had stopped or where they had gone. The phone traces had come back empty. Both Thad's and Linnea's phones appeared to be powered off or destroyed, giving no location data. "Detective?" A young officer poked his head into the command center. "Sheriff wanted me to tell you they found something." Harmon followed the officer through the fog to where a small group had gathered around Sheriff Dalton. The sheriff was kneeling beside something on the ground, about 50 yards from the road, and deeper into the forest. "What is it?" Harmon asked, approaching. Dalton looked up, his expression grim. "A shoe. Looks like a girl's sneaker. Size small. White with purple laces." "Wren," Harmon said immediately. remembering the description Eleanor Kessler had given of what her children had been wearing. The youngest. "There's something else," Dalton added, standing up and brushing the dirt from his knees. "Follow me." About 20 feet further into the trees, Dalton stopped and pointed at the ground. Harmon knelt to examine what looked like a disturbance in the soil, and fallen leaves, a long, narrow depression, as if something heavy had been dragged. "This continues for about 100 yards, Dalton said quietly. "Then it just stops." Harmon surveyed the surrounding area. The fog made it difficult to see more than a few yards in any direction, but he could make out the vague shapes of officers methodically searching the ground for more evidence. "Any footprints?" he asked. "None that we can find. Between the rain last night and the fog this morning, the ground's a mess. But that drag mark..." Dalton trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Harmon warned, though his own mind was racing with dark possibilities. "Have forensics go over every inch of this area, and keep the parents away from here for now." As Harmon walked back toward the command center, he felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. He turned quickly, scanning the foggy forest, but saw nothing but ghostly tree trunks and swirling mist. "Just nerves," he told himself. But he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the opaque whiteness surrounding him, something or someone was observing his every move. By noon, the fog had begun to lift, revealing more of the forest, but no additional signs of the missing Kessler children. The single shoe remained their only tangible evidence, and it told them nothing about where the children might be now. Detective Harmon was interviewing the Kesslers' neighbors when his radio crackled to life. "Harmon, come in." Sheriff Dalton's voice was tense. "Go ahead, Sheriff. We need you back at the station. Now, we have got a situation." Harmon excused himself from the interview and drove quickly back to the sheriff's station, where he found Dalton waiting for him at the entrance, his face ashen. "What's happened? Did you find them?" Dalton shook his head. "No, but we got a package. Addressed to the investigator in charge of the Kessler case. No return address, hand-delivered to the front desk while Judy was on her lunch break. She found it when she got back." "You haven't opened it?" "Thought you should be here." The package sat on Dalton's desk, a small brown paper-wrapped parcel, roughly the size of a shoebox. Harmon pulled on a pair of latex gloves before carefully examining the exterior. The address was printed in block letters. No distinctive features. The paper was standard, available at any office supply store. "We should get the parents here," Harmon said grimly. "If this contains what I think it might..." Dalton nodded and left to make the call. Harmon continued his examination, looking for any clue about the sender or contents before disturbing the wrapping. Finding nothing of note, he carefully began to unwrap the package. Inside was indeed a shoebox, nondescript and unmarked. Harmon lifted the lid and immediately recoiled at what he saw. 4 Polaroid photographs, arranged in a neat row. Each showed one of the Kessler children, bound and gagged, eyes wide with terror, against a background of what appeared to be rough wooden walls. Beneath the photos was a folded piece of paper. With a steady hand that belied his inner turmoil, Harmon unfolded the note and read, "The forest keeps what is freely given. 1965, 1976, 1986. Who will be next?" The cycle continued. The message was constructed from letters cut from magazines and newspapers, a cliché that nonetheless sent a chill down Harmon's spine. "Jesus Christ," Dalton whispered from behind him, having returned in time to see the contents of the box. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means this isn't a random abduction," Harmon said, studying the dates in the message. "And it's not the first time." Eleanor and Marcus Kessler arrived at the station 30 minutes later, hope and dread warring in their expressions as they were ushered into Sheriff Dalton's office. Harmon had deliberated about whether to show them the photographs, but had ultimately decided they needed to confirm if the children in the images were indeed theirs. The confirmation came in the form of Eleanor's scream and Marcus's sudden, violent retching into the wastebasket. There was no doubt the terrified faces in the Polaroids belonged to their children. "They are alive," Eleanor gasped between sobs once she had regained some composure. "At least they were when these were taken. We can still find them." Harmon didn't have the heart to point out that the photos didn't necessarily mean the children were still alive. Instead, he focused on the cryptic message. "Mr. and Mrs. Kessler, do these dates mean anything to you?" Both parents shook their heads, still too distraught to speak much. "What about the phrase, 'the forest keeps what is freely given'? Does that sound familiar at all?" Again, no recognition. Harmon exchanged a glance with Dalton. "Sheriff, can you check the archives for any missing persons cases from 1965 and 1970s, particularly involving multiple victims or children?" Dalton nodded and left the room, leaving Harmon alone with the devastated parents. "We are going to find them," Harmon promised, though he knew better than to make such guarantees. "But I need you to think. Is there anyone who might want to hurt your family? Anyone who's shown unusual interest in your children?" Marcus, who had been silent since viewing the photographs, suddenly looked up. "There was a man at the grocery store last week. He was watching the kids while I was checking out. I didn't think much of it then, but he seemed to be paying special attention to them." "Can you describe him?" "Older man, maybe 60s, thin, with a beard, wearing a green jacket, I think. He smiled at me when he noticed I was watching him watch the kids. It was unsettling." Harmon made notes, though the description could fit dozens of men in Oakhollow. "Anything else distinctive about him? Scars, tattoos, unusual features?" Marcus closed his eyes, trying to recall. "His left hand, I think he was missing fingers, or they were deformed somehow. I noticed when he waved at me. Now they were getting somewhere." "How many fingers was he missing?" "2, I think. The middle and ring finger." Harmon wrote this down, a sense of urgency building. A man with missing fingers would be much easier to identify than just another bearded man in a green jacket. Sheriff Dalton returned, carrying a dusty file box. "Found something," he announced, placing the box on his desk and pulling out several yellowed folders. 1965. 4 children disappeared from the neighboring county. Hammond siblings ages 16, 14, 12, and 8. Bodies never found. The parallel was chilling, but Harmon kept his face neutral as Dalton continued. 1976. Whittaker children ages 17, 15, 13, and 10. Vanished while on a camping trip with their parents in Whispering Pines. Parents claimed they went to sleep with the children in the tent and woke up to find them gone. No trace ever found. 4 children each time, Harmon noted. Similar age spans, and now the Kesslers. He turned to the parents. "Did you know about these previous disappearances?" "No," Eleanor whispered. "How could this happen again? Why didn't anyone warn us?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. The previous cases had gone cold decades ago, fading from public memory as years passed without resolution. The note mentions a cycle, Harmon mused. 1965 to 1976 is 11 years. 1976 to 1986 is 10 years. Not exactly a perfect pattern, but close. "And who will be next?" Dalton added. "He's already planning the next abduction." "Not if we catch him first," Harmon said firmly. He turned back to the Kesslers. "I need you to go home and rest. We will have officers with you around the clock. If the kidnapper makes contact again, we need to be ready." As the shattered parents were escorted out, Harmon studied the Polaroids again, looking for any detail that might indicate where the children were being held. The wooden walls suggested a cabin or shed, but there were thousands of such structures scattered throughout the forest surrounding Oakhollow. One detail caught his eye, a small carved symbol visible on the wall behind Linnea in her photograph. It appeared to be a circle with a horizontal line through it, reminiscent of a stylized eye or perhaps a planetary symbol. "Sheriff, does this symbol mean anything to you?" Harmon pointed it out. Dalton squinted at the image. "Can't say it does. but I know someone who might recognize it. Old man Cavanaugh. He knows all the local history, legends, that sort of thing. Then let's pay him a visit, Harmon said, carefully replacing the photographs in the box. And put out an APB for a man in his 60s with missing middle and ring fingers on his left hand. Someone in town must know who he is. As they left the station, neither man noticed the figure watching from across the street, a thin man in a green jacket, standing perfectly still despite the cold, his left hand tucked into his pocket. Calvin Cavanaugh lived in a small cabin at the edge of town, close enough to whispering pines that the forest seemed to be slowly consuming his property. At 87, he was Oakhollow's unofficial historian, having lived in the area his entire life. Detective, sheriff, he greeted them at the door, his voice surprisingly strong for a man his age. I wondered when you'd come to see me about those missing kids. Inside, the cabin was cluttered with books, maps, and curiosities collected over a lifetime. Cavanaugh led them to a sitting area near a crackling fireplace and lowered himself into a worn armchair. You have heard about the Kessler children, Harmon said. It wasn't a question. Whole town has terrible business. Cavanaugh shook his head sadly. But not the first time, is it? That's why we are here, Dalton explained. We found a note with the dates 1965, 1976, and 1986, and we have reason to believe the disappearances are connected. Cavanaugh's weathered face grew somber. The collector, he said simply. The collector? Harmon repeated. Is that what people call the kidnapper? It's what my grandfather called him, and his father before him. Cavanaugh leaned forward. You think this started in 65? No, gentlemen, it goes back much further. Harmon and Dalton exchanged glances. How far back? Harmon asked. First documented case I know of was 1911. 4 Palmer children vanished from their beds one night. Then the Rhodes children in 1922. The Bennetts in 1933. The pattern skipped during the war years, but picked up again with the Crawfords in 19... All sets of 4 children? Dalton asked incredulously. Not always 4. Sometimes 3. Occasionally 5. But always siblings, always taken together, never found. Cavanaugh rose shakily and shuffled to a bookshelf, returning with an old leather-bound journal. My grandfather started keeping records after the Palmer case. I have continued the tradition. He opened the journal, revealing meticulous notes, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps. The locals used to say the forest demanded a tithe, children freely given to appease whatever lived in the deepest part of whispering pines. The forest keeps what is freely given. Harmon quoted from the note. But these children weren't freely given. They were taken. Cavanaugh's eyes, cloudy with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence, fixed on Harmon. Weren't they? How do you think the same thing happens every decade or so without anyone connecting the dots? Without warnings being posted, families being protected. A chill that had nothing to do with the November weather crept up Harmon's spine. Are you suggesting the town is complicit? Not the town, Cavanaugh corrected. Just certain caretakers. They believe they are protecting everyone else by ensuring the cycle continues. Sacrifice the few to save the many. That's insane, Dalton protested. No one in Oakhollow would participate in kidnapping children. Wouldn't they? Cavanaugh challenged. When the alternative is what happened in 1944? Harmon asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Cavanaugh turned several pages in his journal before finding what he sought. 1944, no children were taken. The pattern was broken. 3 months later, a mysterious illness swept through Oakhollow. 37 dead in 2 weeks, mostly children. Doctors never identified the disease. Coincidence, Dalton said firmly. You can't possibly believe. I believe, Cavanaugh interrupted, that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding. And I believe that some people in this town have made a devil's bargain with those forces. Harmon, more practical-minded, redirected the conversation. Mr. Cavanaugh, we found a symbol in one of the photos of the Kessler children. He sketched the circle with the horizontal line on a notepad and showed it to the old man. Do you recognize this? Cavanaugh paled visibly. Where did you see this? On a wall where the children are being held. What does it mean? It's the mark of the gateway. According to local legend, there are places in Whispering Pines where the veil between worlds is thin. Gateways, they are called. Cavanaugh's hands trembled as he turned to another page in his journal, revealing a drawing nearly identical to the symbol Harmon had sketched. This marks such a place, and where exactly would we find this gateway? Harmon asked, trying to keep the skepticism from his voice. There's an old hunting cabin, deep in the forest, about 7 miles from where you found the Kessler boys' car. It was built on one such gateway, supposedly to contain whatever might come through. Cavanaugh tapped the symbol in his journal. This would be carved above the door. Harmon stood up abruptly. We need the exact location of this cabin. Cavanaugh shook his head. I have never been there myself. But, he hesitated, then continued reluctantly. Gerald Fisher would know. He's the current keeper. Keeper? Dalton echoed. The one who ensures the cycle continues. Cavanaugh's voice had dropped to a whisper. The one who chooses which family will pay the price. And where do we find this Gerald Fisher? Harmon demanded. You don't need to find him, Cavanaugh said, looking out his window toward the darkening forest. He's already found you. Harmon followed his gaze and saw, just at the edge of the property where the forest began, a thin figure in a green jacket, watching the cabin. Even from this distance, Harmon could see the man's left hand was partially clenched, 2 fingers conspicuously absent. Fisher, Harmon breathed, already moving toward the door. But by the time he reached the porch, the figure had vanished into the trees, leaving nothing but swaying branches and encroaching shadows, as evidence he had ever been there. The race to find the Kessler children had truly begun. Oakhollow, Washington, November 15, 1986, 6:23 p.m., 375th. He was right there, Detective Harmon insisted, scanning the tree line with a flashlight. The beam cut through the gathering darkness, revealing nothing but frost-rimmed pines and the occasional startled bird. Fisher was watching us. Sheriff Dalton stood behind him, skepticism etched into his weathered face. Elias, I don't doubt what you saw, but we can't just charge into the forest based on the ramblings of old man Cavanaugh and a glimpse of someone who might be our suspect. Harmon turned, his expression hardening. 4 children are out there, Roy. If there's even a chance Cavanaugh is right about that cabin, I'm not saying we ignore it, Dalton interrupted, raising his hands placatingly. I'm saying we do this right. We organize a proper search party, with maps and coordinates. We get backup from the county. We don't get ourselves lost in Whispering Pines after dark. The detective knew Dalton was right, but every instinct screamed that they were running out of time. He glanced back at Cavanaugh's cabin, where the old man stood framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm light inside. Fine, Harmon conceded. But we move at first light, and I want every available officer looking for Gerald Fisher tonight. As they walked back to their vehicles, Dalton cleared his throat awkwardly. You don't actually believe all that supernatural mumbo-jumbo Cavanaugh was spouting, do you? Gateways between worlds, forest tithes, that's just local folklore. Harmon was silent for a moment, considering. I believe in what I can see and touch, Roy. Right now, that's 4 missing kids and a suspect with a possible hiding place. The rest, I will reserve judgment. But as they drove away, Harmon couldn't shake the image of those photographs, 4 terrified children, bound and helpless, waiting for rescue or something much worse. And beneath that image, a deeper, more insidious thought took root. What if Cavanaugh was right? What if the town itself, or at least some of its residents, had been complicit in these disappearances for generations? He glanced at the houses they passed, warm lights glowing in windows, Families settling in for dinner or television, normal lives continuing while the Kessler's world had shattered. How many of them knew? How many had suspected over the years and chosen to look away? And most disturbing of all, if the pattern had held for so long, what chance did they really have of breaking it now? The search for Gerald Fisher proved frustratingly fruitless. No one at his registered address had seen him in days. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and largely unremarkable, just another aging bachelor in a small town where everyone at least recognized each other, if not knew them well. Did they mention his hand? Harmon asked the officer who'd conducted the interviews. Yes, sir, said he lost the fingers in a logging accident back in the 70s. Never seemed to bother him much. It was well after midnight when Harmon finally returned to his small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. Too wired to sleep, he spread the case files across his kitchen table, the sparse documentation of the Kessler disappearance alongside the decades-old reports on the Hammond and Whittaker cases that Dalton had unearthed. The similarities were undeniable. In each case, siblings had vanished together, leaving minimal evidence. In each case, the investigation had eventually stalled, with leads drying up and witnesses providing contradictory or unhelpful information. And in each case, the children had never been found, not alive, not dead, not a trace. Harmon rubbed his eyes, fighting exhaustion. Something about the pattern bothered him. Beyond the obvious horror of it, he reviewed Cavanaugh's assertions again. Disappearances dating back to at least 1911, occurring roughly every 11 years, always involving siblings. On impulse, he pulled out a notepad and began listing the years: 1911, 1922, 1933, 1954, 1965, 1970. What happened to 1944? He murmured, then remembered Cavanaugh's claim no children taken that year, followed by a mysterious illness that killed dozens. Harmon reached for the phone and dialed the sheriff's home number. Despite the late hour, Dalton answered on the third ring, his voice groggy but alert. Roy, I need you to check something in the archives tomorrow. Any unusual deaths in Oakhollow around 1944, particularly illnesses affecting children. This couldn't wait until morning? Dalton grumbled. It is morning, Harmon pointed out. And no, it can't wait. I think Cavanaugh might be onto something with this cycle business. After hanging up, Harmon returned to the files, focusing now on the most recent case. The Kessler children had last been seen in their car on Pinecrest Road, near the entrance to Whispering Pines. The car had been abandoned, door open, keys in the ignition, as if they had left in a hurry or been forced out. But there had been no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of violence. It was as if they had simply decided to walk into the forest of their own accord. The forest keeps what is freely given, Harmon quoted from the kidnapper's note. What could make 4 children voluntarily leave the safety of their car and walk into a dark forest during a rainstorm? A knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. Hand moving instinctively to his holster, Harmon approached the door cautiously. Who is it? Elias, it's Eleanor Kessler. Please, I need to talk to you. Surprised and concerned, Harmon opened the door to find Eleanor standing in the hallway, her face pale and drawn, eyes red-rimmed from crying but now eerily calm. Mrs. Kessler, you should be at home. There are officers. I slipped out, she interrupted, stepping past him into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. They are watching the house, not me specifically. I told Marcus I was taking a bath. Harmon closed the door, troubled by her appearance and behavior. What's so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning? Eleanor stood in the center of his small living room, arms wrapped around herself as if cold, though the apartment was adequately heated. I remembered something about those dates in the note. Instantly alert, Harmon gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, a strange energy radiating from her that seemed at odds with her exhausted appearance. My grandmother, she began, her voice unnaturally steady. Used to tell stories about Oakhollow, about the forest. She called it the Hungry Woods. She said it needed to be fed, or it would feed itself. Mrs. Kessler, I thought they were just stories, she continued as if he hadn't spoken. Scary tales to keep children from wandering into the forest alone. But she mentioned years when the forest had to be fed. 1954 was one of them. She said her cousin's children were taken that year. Harmon's blood ran cold. The Crawfords? They were related to you? Eleanor nodded slowly. My grandmother's sister married a Crawford. They had 4 children. All disappeared one night. And you never mentioned this connection. I didn't make the connection until tonight. I was trying to sleep, and suddenly I remembered her stories, the years she mentioned. 1954, 1965, 1976. Her voice broke slightly. She died in 1980. She couldn't warn me about Harmon guided her to the couch, genuinely concerned now about her mental state. Mrs. Kessler, I understand you are grasping for explanations, but these are just coincidences. Your children were not taken by a forest. Then who took them? She demanded, a flash of anger breaking through her eerie calm. And why? Why my family? Why now? We believe a man named Gerald Fisher may be involved, Harmon said carefully, deciding that giving her some information might help ground her. We are looking for him now. Gerald Fisher, she repeated, the name seeming to trigger something. The man from the Historical Society? Thin, with a beard? Harmon leaned forward. You know him. He came to the house about a month ago. Said he was documenting the oldest families in Oakhollow for the Historical Society archives. Took pictures of us. Asked about our genealogy. She frowned, struggling to remember. He seemed particularly interested when I mentioned my grandmother was a Crawford before marriage. Did he spend time alone with your children during this visit? Eleanor shook her head. No, they were at school, but he asked a lot of questions about them. Their ages, their interests. Her eyes widened with sudden realization. Oh God, he was selecting them, wasn't he? He was deciding if they were suitable. Harmon didn't confirm or deny her conclusion, though privately he was thinking the same thing. Mrs. Kessler, I need you to go home now. It's not safe for you to be out alone, especially if Fisher is still in the area. I can't just sit at home waiting while my children are out there, she protested, rising to her feet. I came here because I thought you should know about the Crawford connection, and because I want to help with the search tomorrow. Absolutely not, Harmon said firmly. We have trained professionals. They are my children, Eleanor cut him off, her voice steel. I'm going to that forest tomorrow, with or without your permission. I thought you should know. Before Harmon could argue further, she was out the door, leaving him standing in his living room, the echo of her determination lingering in the air. November 16th, 1986, 7:05 a.m. The search party assembled at the edge of Whispering Pines State Forest as the sun breached the horizon, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Despite Harmon's objections, both Eleanor and Marcus Kessler had joined, standing slightly apart from the rest of the group, their breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. Sheriff Dalton spread a detailed topographical map across the hood of his patrol car. According to Cavanaugh's information and our own records, there's an old hunting cabin in this area, he said, indicating a remote section of the forest about 7 miles from where Thad's car had been found. It's not on any official maps because it predates the state park designation, but local hunters know about it. Has anyone checked it before now? Harmon asked, surprised that such an obvious location might have been overlooked. It's deep in the restricted area of the park, Dalton explained. Off-limits due to unstable terrain from old mining operations. We didn't consider it initially because it's so far from where the car was found, and there's no direct trail. Harmon studied the map, noting the rugged terrain and significant distance. So we are looking at what? A 4-hour hike each way. At least, Dalton confirmed. and that's assuming good conditions and no delays. The group divided into 4 teams, each assigned to approach the cabin from a different direction. Harmon deliberately placed himself with the team that excluded the Kesslers, preferring to keep his focus on the search rather than managing their emotional reactions. "Everyone stays in radio contact," Dalton instructed the assembled searchers. "Check in every 30 minutes. If you find anything at all, you report it immediately and wait for backup. No heroics." As the teams prepared to depart, Harmon noticed a late arrival to the gathering, Calvin Cavanaugh, looking even more ancient in the harsh morning light, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. "Mr. Cavanaugh," Harmon greeted him with surprise. "I didn't expect to see you joining the search." "Not joining," the old man clarified. "Warning, you are making a mistake, detective." "What mistake would that be?" Cavanaugh glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then lowered his voice. "Going in daylight. The gateway isn't open during the day. You won't find anything." Harmon sighed, his patience wearing thin with the old man's cryptic pronouncements. "Mr. Cavanaugh, we are not looking for supernatural gateways. We are looking for 4 missing children who may be held in a very real physical cabin." "The cabin exists," Cavanaugh acknowledged. "But what you seek will only be found after dark, when the gateway opens." He reached into his pocket and pressed something into Harmon's hand, a small, smooth stone with the same circle and line symbol etched into its surface. "Keep this with you. It offers some protection." Before Harmon could respond, Dalton called for the teams to move out. With a last puzzled glance at Cavanaugh, Harmon pocketed the stone and joined his group as they entered the forest. The journey through whispering pines was arduous, the terrain growing increasingly difficult as they moved deeper into the forest. What had begun as well-maintained hiking trails gradually gave way to overgrown paths, then to no paths at all, forcing them to navigate by compass and map alone. Despite the clear sky above, the dense canopy of pine trees filtered the sunlight into a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The air was still and cold, their footsteps muffled by a thick carpet of pine needles, creating an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird. Harmon's team consisted of himself, 2 county deputies named Richards and Alvarez, and a local volunteer firefighter who claimed to know the area well. They maintained a brisk pace, stopping only briefly to check the map and report their position via radio. During one such stop, around midday, Richards suddenly froze, raising his hand for silence. "Did you hear that?" The group fell still, listening intently. At first, Harmon heard nothing but the soft whisper of wind through the pine branches. Then, faintly, a sound reached him, a child's laughter, high and clear, coming from somewhere ahead of them. "Wren?" Harmon called out, immediately moving toward the sound. "Wren Kessler?" The laughter came again, closer now, followed by what sounded like running footsteps moving away from them. "This way." Harmon broke into a run, the others following close behind. They crashed through underbrush, ducked beneath low-hanging branches, following the sound that always seemed just ahead, just out of sight. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound ceased. Harmon stopped, breathing hard, listening intently. Nothing. "Did we lose it?" Richards asked, scanning the surrounding forest. "I think it lost us," Harmon replied uneasily, suddenly aware of how far they had strayed from their planned route. He reached for his radio to report their position, only to find nothing but static on all channels. "Interference," Alvarez suggested. "Happens in these mountains. We need to get back on course," the firefighter said, consulting their map. "We have veered about half a mile northeast of our route." As they reoriented themselves, Harmon couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The laughter had sounded exactly like a child, like Wren, based on the recordings her parents had shared, but there had been something off about it, something not quite human. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the stone Cavanaugh had given him. It was warm to the touch, despite the cold air, as if it had absorbed body heat or something else. By late afternoon, they had made significant progress, the terrain beginning to show signs of the old mining operations. Dalton had mentioned collapsed tunnels, rusted equipment half buried in the earth. Warning signs faded almost to illegibility. "We are getting close," the firefighter announced, checking the map again. The cabin should be about a quarter-mile ahead, in a small clearing near the base of that ridge. They approached more cautiously now, spreading out to cover more ground while maintaining visual contact with each other. Harmon felt a growing sense of anticipation mingled with dread. What would they find? The children, alive and waiting for rescue, or something much worse? Richards spotted at first a plume of smoke rising thin and gray against the darkening sky. "Someone's there," he said quietly, pointing. The cabin, when they finally got a clear view of it, was smaller than Harmon had expected, a crude, single-room structure built of rough-hewn logs, its small windows dark and shuttered. The smoke came from a stone chimney on one side, suggesting occupation. Harmon signaled for the team to take cover while he radioed their position. To his relief, the static had cleared, and he was able to reach Dalton. "We have found it," he reported. "Signs of current occupation. Requesting backup before we approach." "Roger that," Dalton responded. "Our team is approximately 40 minutes from your position. The Kessler's team is closer, maybe 20 minutes out. Tell them to hold their position," Harmon instructed. "We will maintain surveillance until you arrive." The wait was excruciating. As the sun sank lower behind the mountains, the forest grew darker, shadows lengthening and merging, until the cabin stood in a pool of gloom, the only light coming from the faint orange glow of firelight visible through cracks in the shutters. Harmon used binoculars to study the structure, looking for any movement, any sign of the children or their captor. At one point a shadow passed in front of the window, tall and thin, unmistakably adult. Gerald Fisher, it seemed likely. Just as Dalton's team arrived, joining them in their concealed position at the edge of the clearing, Harmon's radio crackled to life. "Detective Harmon," Eleanor Kessler's voice came through, tight with suppressed emotion. "We can see the cabin. We are in position on the north side of the clearing." Harmon swore under his breath. "Mrs. Kessler, I told you to hold your position." "We heard sounds," she replied, ignoring his reprimand. Children's voices, coming from inside. Harmon exchanged an alarmed glance with Dalton. Their careful plan was unraveling. "Mrs. Kessler, do not approach the cabin. I repeat, do not." But it was too late. Even as he spoke, he saw movement at the north edge of the clearing, two figures emerging from the trees, running toward the cabin. Eleanor and Marcus Kessler, driven by desperation and hope, had thrown caution to the wind. "Move in," Harmon ordered, abandoning stealth as he and the others broke cover, racing to intercept the Kesslers before they reached the cabin. But they were too far away. Eleanor reached the cabin first, pounding on the door. "Thad, Linnea, Quentin, Wren, we are here." The door swung open, revealing darkness beyond. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, Marcus right behind her. By the time Harmon reached the cabin, the door had closed again. He tried the handle locked. "Sheriff." "Around back," he shouted, drawing his weapon as he positioned himself beside the door. Before Dalton could respond, a scream came from inside the cabin. Eleanor's voice filled with horror rather than fear. Then silence. Harmon didn't wait. He stepped back and kicked the door, the aged wood splintering around the lock. Gun raised, he entered, eyes struggling to adjust to the dimness inside. The cabin consisted of a single room, sparsely furnished with a rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small cot in one corner, and a fireplace where a small fire burned low. Hanging from the ceiling beams were bundles of dried herbs and flowers, giving the air a strange, sweet scent. And there, in the center of the room, stood Eleanor and Marcus Kessler, frozen in place, staring at something on the table. 4 small cloth dolls, arranged in a row. Each doll wore scraps of fabric that matched the descriptions of what the Kessler children had been wearing when they disappeared. Beside the dolls lay 4 locks of hair, brown, blonde, red, and black, corresponding to each child. But no children, no Gerald Fisher. Just an empty cabin, 4 dolls, and an atmosphere so thick with dread it felt like a physical presence. "Where are they?" Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "The voices, we heard them." Harmon moved cautiously to the table, examining the dolls without touching them. Each had been crafted with disturbing attention to detail, down to tiny representations of Thad's varsity jacket, Linnea's favorite sweater, Quentin's glasses, and Wren's purple shoelaces. "Outside," Marcus suddenly said, his head tilting as if listening. "They are outside now." Before anyone could stop him, he rushed back out the door. The others followed quickly, emerging into the clearing just as the last light of day faded from the sky. The forest had changed. Where before the trees had stood separate and distinct, now they seemed to waver and blur, their boundaries becoming indistinct in the gathering darkness. The air felt heavier, charged with something that raised the hairs on Harmon's arms. And there, at the edge of the clearing, 4 small figures stood hand in hand, facing the forest. "Thad, Linnea, Quentin, Wren," Eleanor cried out, running toward them. "Mrs. Kessler, wait," Harmon called, but she didn't slow. As Eleanor approached the figures, they turned in unison. In the fading light, their faces were shadowed, unreadable, but something about their movements seemed wrong, too fluid, too coordinated, as if they were puppets controlled by a single hand. "Mum?" The voice sounded like Thad's, but hollow, distant. "You shouldn't have come," Eleanor faltered, confusion replacing relief. "Thad, what's wrong?" "We are here to take you home." "We are home," the figure that looked like Linnea said, her voice containing the same hollow quality. "The forest has welcomed us." Marcus had caught up to his wife now, both of them standing just a few yards from the children. "What are you talking about? Come here right now." "You don't understand," Quentin's voice now, but wrong. So wrong. "The forest keeps what is freely given." "We didn't give you to anyone," Eleanor cried, reaching for them. As her hands stretched out, the figure that looked like Wren stepped forward, into a shaft of fading daylight that penetrated the canopy. And in that moment, Harmon saw what Eleanor and Marcus could not yet see from their angle. The child's face was blank, featureless, as smooth as undisturbed water. "Mrs. Kessler, get back," Harmon shouted, running toward them, gun still in hand, though he had no idea if it would be of any use against whatever these things were. The 4 figures turned as one toward the darkest part of the forest, where the shadows had deepened into what looked like a solid wall of blackness. And standing before that darkness was a 5th figure, tall, thin, wearing a green jacket. Gerald Fisher raised his left hand, the 2 missing fingers clearly visible even in the dim light, and beckoned to the children. They moved toward him in perfect unison, still holding hands. "No." Eleanor lunged forward, grabbing for the Wren thing's arm. Her hand passed through it as if through smoke, the figure momentarily disintegrating before reforming, never breaking its steady pace toward Fisher and the darkness beyond. Fisher turned his gaze toward the distraught parents, and even from a distance, Harmon could see that his eyes reflected the last light like an animal's, glowing, inhuman. "The cycle continues," Fisher said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing, though he barely seemed to move his lips. "The forest has chosen. The forest must be fed." "Like hell," Harmon muttered, raising his gun and firing at Fisher. The shot echoed through the clearing, but Fisher didn't flinch, didn't react at all, as the bullet seemed to pass through him without effect. And then, to Harmon's horror, Fisher began to change. His form, elongated, stretched, his limbs extending impossibly, his face melting and reforming into something that resembled a human face. The way a child's crude drawing resembles its subject, recognizable, but fundamentally wrong. The not children reached Fisher's side, and together they stepped into the wall of darkness. As they did, the darkness itself seemed to pulse, to breathe, to reach out tendrils toward the humans still in the clearing. "Run," Harmon shouted, grabbing Eleanor's arm and pulling her back. "Everyone back to the cabin, now." Most of the search party obeyed instantly, retreating in terror from the advancing darkness. But Marcus Kessler, driven by desperation and grief, ran not away but toward the darkness, toward the last place he had seen the shapes of his children. "Marcus, no!" Eleanor screamed, fighting against Harmon's grip, but it was too late. Marcus reached the edge of the darkness and, without hesitation, plunged into it. There was no sound, no scream, no indication of what happened to him. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, swallowed by the impossible blackness. Harmon dragged Eleanor back toward the cabin, where Dalton and the others had already retreated. The darkness continued to advance, consuming the clearing inch by inch, tree by tree. Inside the cabin, Harmon slammed the door shut, though he doubted it would provide any real protection against what was outside. The search party huddled together in the center of the room, weapons drawn but useless, faces pale with fear and confusion. "What the hell is happening?" Dalton demanded, his usual authority shaken. "What were those things?" "I don't know," Harmon admitted, but Cavanaugh was right. This isn't a normal kidnapping. Eleanor stood by the window, staring out at the advancing darkness, her expression strangely calm now. "The gateway," she murmured. "It's open." Harmon joined her at the window, watching as the darkness crept closer to the cabin. "Mrs. Kessler, do you know something about this?" She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight in the same animal-like way Fisher's had. "My grandmother told me the stories. I didn't believe them. I should have." A chill ran through Harmon as he realized what she was saying. You knew about the cycle, about the forest." "Not until it was too late," she whispered. "Not until they were taken. But now I understand. The forest keeps what is freely given, but it also keeps what gives itself freely." "Marcus," Harmon said, understanding dawning. "He gave himself to the forest." Eleanor nodded, a single tear tracking down her cheek. "To be with our children, and now I must do the same." Before Harmon could react, she had unlatched the window and was climbing through it. "Eleanor, stop," he lunged for her, but she was already outside, walking calmly toward the wall of darkness that had now surrounded the cabin on all sides, leaving only a small circle of clear ground. Harmon moved to follow her, but felt a hand on his arm. "Let her go," Dalton said quietly. "There's nothing we can do for her now." As they watched, Eleanor Kessler walked into the darkness without hesitation or fear, disappearing as completely as her husband had. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness receded, pulling back from the cabin, from the clearing, withdrawing into the forest, until only the normal shadows of night remained. The gateway had closed. November 17th, 1986. 10:22 a.m. 44. The official report described the events in the forest as a tragic accident. Marcus and Eleanor Kessler, distraught over the disappearance of their children, had become separated from the search party in difficult terrain as night fell. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of the entire Kessler family had been found. The witnesses, Harmon, Dalton, and the other members of the search party had agreed, without discussion or debate, to omit the more inexplicable aspects of what they had seen. Some truths were too fantastic, too terrible to be recorded in official documents. Gerald Fisher was never found, though his house was searched thoroughly. The only item of interest discovered was a small leather-bound book containing dates and family names, going back to 1911, ending with Kessler, 1986, and, chillingly, a blank space marked. Harmon sat in Maggie's diner, at the same window seat where he had been when the Kessler case began, staring out at the rain. It had been 3 days since the incident in the forest, and he had slept little, his dreams haunted by featureless faces and encroaching darkness. The bell above the diner door jingled, and Calvin Cavanaugh entered, shaking rain from his coat before making his way to Harmon's table. "May I join you, detective?" he asked, though he was already lowering himself into the opposite seat. Harmon nodded, too exhausted to refuse. "Have you come to say I told you so?" "No," Cavanaugh replied, his aged face solemn. "I have come to prepare you." "Prepare me for what?" "For your role. The keeper is gone. The forest will need a new caretaker." Harmon stared at him, a cold dread settling in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" "You were marked, detective." Cavanaugh gestured to Harmon's pocket, where the stone with the gateway symbol still rested. "You carried the sign. You witnessed the gateway open. The forest has chosen you." "That's insane," Harmon said flatly. "I'm not participating in whatever sick tradition allowed children to be taken for generations." "You misunderstand," Cavanaugh said quietly. "The keeper doesn't choose the sacrifices. The forest does. The keeper merely facilitates, ensures the cycle continues smoothly, with minimal disruption to the town. And if I refuse?" Cavanaugh's expression grew grim. "Remember 1944, detective? No sacrifice, no keeper, and 37 dead, mostly children." Harmon's hand curled into a fist on the table. "You are asking me to become a kidnapper, a murderer. I'm not asking anything. I'm simply informing you of what is already in motion." Cavanaugh rose slowly to his feet. "You have 11 years to come to terms with your role, detective. Until 1997, I suggest you use that time wisely." As Cavanaugh shuffled toward the door, Harmon called after him, "I will find a way to stop it, to end the cycle permanently." The old man paused, looking back with something like pity in his rheumy eyes. "Better men than you have tried, detective. The forest always wins." After Cavanaugh left, Harmon sat for a long time, watching the rain and turning the smooth stone over and over in his fingers. The symbol seemed to shift in the dim light, sometimes a simple line through a circle, sometimes something more complex, more meaningful. He knew what he should do: throw the stone away, leave Oakhollow, report everything he had seen to authorities outside the town. But something held him back, a nagging certainty that Cavanaugh was right, that the forest would not be denied, that the cycle would continue with or without his participation. And perhaps, if he stayed, if he accepted this unwanted role, he could find a way to change things, to save future children from the fate that had befallen the Kesslers and all the others before them. Or perhaps the forest would change him instead, molding him slowly over the years, until he became just like Fisher, a willing servant to whatever ancient hunger dwelled beneath the pines. Only time would tell, and time, it seemed, was the one thing he had plenty of. 11 years, to be exact. Oakhollow, Washington, March 22, 2024, 3:15 p.m. 58. Dr. Meredith Chen pulled her rental car to a stop at the edge of Whispering Pines State Forest, consulting the GPS on her phone one last time before stepping out. According to the coordinates she'd been given, this was the place, or close enough that she could continue on foot. The forest looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, nothing like the ominous presence it had been described as in the journal she'd studied. Birds sang, a light breeze rustled the pine needles, and the air smelled fresh and clean. It was hard to imagine this tranquil setting as the site of one of the most bizarre unsolved mysteries in the Pacific Northwest. Meredith opened the trunk and removed her equipment: a ground-penetrating radar device, a metal detector, sample collection kits, and a high-resolution camera. As a forensic archaeologist specializing in cold cases, she was accustomed to working with minimal information and maximum skepticism, but this case had intrigued her from the moment she'd read the file. 4 siblings disappearing without a trace in 1986, followed by their parents vanishing during the search. A lead investigator who subsequently descended into alcoholism, leaving behind journals filled with increasingly paranoid and fantastical accounts of what had happened. a town with a history of similar disappearances dating back generations. And now, nearly 4 decades later, new evidence had emerged, evidence that might finally explain what had happened to the Kessler family and the others who had vanished in Whispering Pines. Meredith checked her watch. Her contact, a local historian named David Cavanaugh, grandson of Calvin Cavanaugh, who had figured prominently in the original investigation, had promised to meet her here at 3:30. That gave her 15 minutes to get her bearings and prepare her equipment. As she worked, Meredith couldn't help but feel a strange sense of being watched. She glanced up frequently, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. Just nerves, she told herself. The power of suggestion after reading too many accounts of the forest's supposed sentience. At precisely 3:30, a battered pickup truck pulled up beside her rental car. A man in his 50s climbed out, tall and lean with a salt and pepper beard and watchful eyes. "Dr. Chen," he called, approaching with his hand extended. "David Cavanaugh. Thank you for coming all this way." They shook hands, and Meredith studied him curiously. "Your email was intriguing, Mr. Cavanaugh. You said you have found something that changes everything we thought we knew about the Kessler case." Cavanaugh nodded, his expression grave. "I have, but it's easier to show you than tell you. It's about a mile into the forest. Are you ready for a hike?" Meredith gestured to her equipment. "As ready as I will ever be. Lead the way." As they set off along a narrow trail, Cavanaugh began to fill in some of the background. "My grandfather was considered something of a local eccentric. His stories about the forest, about the gateway, and the cycle of disappearances were dismissed as the ramblings of a superstitious old man." "But you believe them?" Meredith asked, careful to keep her tone neutral. "I believe he believed them," Cavanaugh replied diplomatically, "and I believe that something happened in this forest, something that defies conventional explanation. But I'm more interested in facts than folklore, which is why I contacted you when I found the site." "And what exactly is the site?" Meredith pressed, stepping carefully over a fallen log. "The cabin," Cavanaugh said simply. "The one where Detective Harmon claimed to have witnessed the Kessler parents walk into a wall of darkness. It was never found during subsequent searches, which further discredited his account. Most people assumed he had a breakdown, invented the whole story. But you found it." "I found something," Cavanaugh corrected. "Whether it's the same cabin from Harmon's report remains to be seen. But it matches the description, and it's in roughly the right location." They continued in silence for several minutes, the trail gradually becoming steeper and less defined. Finally, Cavanaugh stopped at the edge of a small clearing. "There," he said, pointing to what appeared to be a pile of collapsed timber and rotting logs. "That's all that's left of it. But look above what would have been the door." Meredith followed his gaze and saw, carved into a beam that had once supported the cabin's entrance, a symbol, a circle with a horizontal line through it. The gateway symbol, exactly as described in Harmon's journals. "That doesn't prove anything," she said, though she couldn't deny the chill that ran through her at the sight. "It could have been carved recently by someone who read Harmon's account." "That's why I haven't touched anything," Cavanaugh assured her. "I wanted you to examine it properly, scientifically. Date the wood, the carvings, analyze any traces left behind." Meredith approached the collapsed structure cautiously, her trained eye already assessing what she was seeing. The cabin had not fallen recently. The decay was extensive, vegetation growing through and around the collapsed timbers, suggesting it had been in this state for many years. "Help me set up the GPR," she instructed, referring to the ground-penetrating radar. "I want to see what's underneath before we disturb anything." As they worked to position the equipment, Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed. Twice she turned quickly, certain she would catch sight of someone at the edge of the clearing, but each time she saw nothing but trees and shadows. The GPR began its scan, sending radio waves into the ground beneath the collapsed cabin and creating a digital image of what lay below the surface. Meredith watched the screen intently as the data began to form a picture. "That's odd," she murmured, adjusting the settings to get a clearer image. "What is it?" Cavanaugh asked, peering over her shoulder. "There appears to be a cavity beneath the cabin floor, a significant one, roughly circular, about 15 feet in diameter." She pointed to the screen. "See how the density changes here. This isn't natural. It's too uniform, too perfectly shaped." "A cellar," Cavanaugh suggested. "Maybe, but there's no clear access point. No indication of stairs or a trapdoor in the cabin's foundation." Meredith frowned, studying the image more closely. "And look at the depth. It extends at least 30 feet down. That's excessive for a cabin cellar, especially one this old." They continued the scan, moving the GPR in a grid pattern to create a comprehensive image of what lay beneath. When they had finished, Meredith sat back on her heels, perplexed by what they had found. "It's like a vertical shaft," she said, reviewing the compiled data. "Perfectly cylindrical, extending deeper than the GPR can penetrate. And there's something else." She pointed to anomalies at the edges of the shaft. "These readings suggest there might be objects or remains embedded in the walls of the shaft." "Remains?" Cavanaugh repeated, his voice tense. "Human remains? I can't say for certain without excavation, but the density and size are consistent with that possibility." Meredith looked up at him, her scientific detachment momentarily shaken by the implications. "Miss Cavanaugh, if there are human remains down there, and if they date back to the periods of the reported disappearances—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Both of them understood what it would mean: confirmation that the stories of missing children, of families vanishing without a trace, had a concrete, horrifying explanation. "We need to excavate," Meredith decided, standing up and brushing dirt from her knees. "But we will need proper equipment, permits, a full team. This isn't something we can do alone or without authorization." Cavanaugh nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the collapsed cabin with its ominous symbol. "I will make the necessary arrangements. But Dr. Chen, there's something else you should see before we leave. Something I found when I first discovered this place." He led her to a fallen section of the cabin's wall, pointing to what appeared to be a small metal box, partially visible among the rotting timbers. "I didn't open it. I thought it should be documented in situ." Meredith knelt beside the box, carefully photographing it from multiple angles before gently extracting it from the debris. It was a simple tin container, the kind once used for tobacco or small valuables, now corroded and dented with age. With gloved hands, she delicately pried open the lid. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, remarkably well preserved, thanks to the protection of the metal box, and beside it a smooth stone bearing the same circle and line symbol that was carved above the cabin door. Meredith opened the notebook with extreme care, the aged pages threatening to crumble at her touch. On the first page, written in a tight, controlled hand, were the words, "The Journal of Elias Harmon, Keeper of the Gateway, 19," and below that, a single sentence that made Meredith's blood run cold. "I have found a way to end the cycle, but the price is higher than I ever imagined." Oakhollow, Washington, March 23, 2024, 7:42 a.m. Dr. Meredith Chen hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in her motel room, carefully examining Elias Harmon's journal by lamplight. The pages brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting had changed over the decades, starting as the neat, precise script of a professional detective and gradually deteriorating into something more frantic. The letters pressing deeper into the paper as if the writer's emotions had physically manifested through his pen. The earliest entries, dated just after the Kessler disappearance in November 1986, documented Harmon's initial disbelief and resistance to what he had witnessed in the forest. November 20, 1986. "I'm writing this down to prove to myself that I haven't lost my mind. What happened in that cabin, what we all saw, it defies explanation. Sheriff Dalton suggested we modify our official report. For our own good, he said. No one would believe the truth anyway. I agreed, but I need to preserve what really happened, even if only for myself. The entries continued, chronicling Harmon's growing obsession with understanding the cycle of disappearances. He had researched town records, interviewed elderly residents, and spent countless hours in the forest, searching for the cabin that had seemingly vanished along with the Kessler family. February 3, 1987. I found Calvin Cavanaugh dead this morning. Apparent suicide. A note beside him read only, "The forest calls. I can no longer resist." He was the only one who understood what we are facing. Now I'm alone with this burden. July 17, 1987. I have mapped every disappearance I could find in town records. The pattern is undeniable. Approximately every 11 years without fail. Always multiple victims. Always from the same family. What force could possibly maintain such precision over more than a century? Meredith had been particularly disturbed by the entries from 1996, as the 11-year cycle approached its next iteration. October 12, 1996. I feel it now. A pulling, a hunger that isn't my own. The forest is watching me, waiting. I understand why Fisher did what he did. It's not a choice, not really. Either I select a family, or the forest will take more. So many more. December 3, 1996. I have chosen. God forgive me. I have chosen. The Mercer family, 4 children, ages similar to the Kesslers. I have been watching them for weeks. Tomorrow, I make contact in my official capacity. A routine safety check, I will tell them. And then, but the most shocking entry came next. December 4, 1996. I couldn't do it. Stood on their porch, saw the children through the window, and couldn't take another step. Drove to the forest instead, to the place where the gateway should be. Offered myself instead. The forest rejected me. Not yours to give, a voice said, though no one was there. The hunger grows. The pain is unbearable now. The subsequent entries became increasingly erratic, describing Harmon's desperate search for an alternative to sacrificing children to whatever entity dwelled in the forest. He had consulted occultists, paranormal researchers, even traveled to other parts of the world, seeking similar phenomena. The final entry, dated just 3 months ago, sent chills down Meredith's spine. January 10, 2024. After all these years, I have found it. The true gateway, not the cabin that was merely a door. The gateway is beneath, a perfect cylinder descending into darkness. I have seen what lies within. I have seen them all, the Kesslers, the Whittakers, the Hammonds, every child taken since this began. They are not dead, not exactly, but what they have become. God help me, I finally understand the cycle, the purpose, and I know how to end it. The price is my life, but that's a bargain I made peace with long ago. If anyone finds this journal, burn the forest. It's the only way to be sure. The entry ended there. No explanation of what Harmon had discovered. No details of how he planned to end the cycle. Just that cryptic warning and what appeared to be a blood stain smudging the bottom corner of the page. A knock at her door startled Meredith from her thoughts. David Cavanaugh stood in the hallway, looking as though he'd slept as little as she had. "The permits came through," he said without preamble, "and I have got a team of workers waiting at the site. We can begin excavation immediately." Meredith nodded, gathering her equipment and the carefully sealed journal. "Have you spoken with the local authorities about what we found?" "Sheriff Martinson is meeting us there," Cavanaugh replied as they walked to his truck. He was skeptical, to say the least, but the mention of possible human remains was enough to get him moving. As they drove through the awakening town, Meredith studied Cavanaugh's profile. "Your grandfather," she began carefully. "You said he was considered an eccentric, but after reading Harmon's journal, it's clear he knew a great deal about what was happening. Why didn't anyone believe him?" Cavanaugh's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Oakhollow has a way of forgetting things it doesn't want to remember. My grandfather tried to warn people about the 1986 disappearances before they happened. No one listened. After the Kesslers vanished, he became the town pariah. People blamed him, said his talk of cycles and forest sacrifices had somehow inspired a kidnapper. And what do you believe? Cavanaugh was silent for a long moment. I believe something terrible has been happening in this town for generations, and everyone who tried to stop it either disappeared or was discredited. I believe my grandfather killed himself because he couldn't live with what he knew, and I believe Elias Harmon spent nearly 40 years trying to atone for something that wasn't his fault. They drove the rest of the way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at the forest's edge, a small convoy of vehicles was already waiting a sheriff's cruiser, 2 vans bearing the logo of a local construction company, and a coroner's wagon, a silent acknowledgement of what they expected to find. Sheriff Martinson approached as they parked, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a perpetually skeptical expression. "Dr. Chen," he greeted her curtly. "I have got to say, this all seems like a wild goose chase to me. The Kessler case has been cold for decades." "I understand your skepticism, Sheriff," Meredith replied diplomatically. "But the ground-penetrating radar confirms there's something beneath that cabin site, something man-made and substantial. Don't you want to know what it is?" The sheriff grunted non-committedly, but gestured for the work crew to begin unloading their equipment. "Just don't expect to find anything that's going to rewrite history. More likely it's just an old root cellar or mining shaft." Meredith exchanged a glance with Cavanaugh, neither bothering to argue. The evidence would speak for itself soon enough. The excavation proceeded methodically throughout the morning. The collapsed remains of the cabin were carefully documented, photographed and removed piece by piece. The symbol above where the door had been the circle bisected by a horizontal line was preserved intact, the beam containing it set aside for further analysis. By noon, they had cleared the cabin debris and exposed the foundation, a simple rectangle of fitted stones, with no visible access point to whatever lay beneath. The GPR had confirmed there was a cavity directly under the center of the cabin floor, but no trapdoor or stairway was evident. "We need to remove the floor," Meredith directed the workers. "Carefully, 1 stone at a time, and document the position of each." As the stones were lifted, a pattern began to emerge. Unlike the rough natural stones of the foundation's perimeter, the center stones were perfectly circular, fitted together like a massive mosaic or puzzle, and carved into each stone was a tiny version of the gateway symbol. "These aren't local," Meredith observed, examining one of the removed stones. "The material is different, darker, denser, and these carvings were done with precision tools, not hand implements." When the last of the central stones was removed, a collective gasp rose from the assembled workers and officials. Where the floor had been now gaped a perfect circle of absolute darkness, not a hole or shaft in the conventional sense, but what appeared to be a complete absence of light, as if that circular space simply refused to reflect or admit illumination. "What the hell?" Sheriff Martinson murmured, approaching the edge cautiously. He shone his flashlight directly into the darkness, but the beam seemed to disappear at the boundary, neither illuminating the interior nor reflecting back. "This isn't natural." "No," Meredith agreed quietly. "It isn't." She knelt at the edge of the circle, careful not to get too close, and held a measuring tape out over the darkness. The tape extended normally until it crossed the boundary, at which point it simply vanished from sight, though she could still feel its weight in her hand. "We need to lower a camera," she decided, turning to her equipment bag. "Something that can transmit images back to us without having to be retrieved." As she prepared a small, high-resolution camera attached to a thin cable, Cavanaugh approached with a troubled expression. "Dr. Chen, I have been thinking about something in my grandfather's papers. He mentioned that the gateway only truly opens at night. What we are seeing now may just be a dormant state." Meredith paused, considering this. You think it might be different, more active, after dark? I think we should proceed with extreme caution, Cavanaugh replied. Whatever this is, it's what took the Kessler family and who knows how many others. Sheriff Martinson had overheard their exchange. This is ridiculous, he scoffed. It's just a hole in the ground, not some supernatural doorway. Probably an old mining shaft that was covered up when they built the cabin. To prove his point, he picked up a small stone and tossed it into the darkness. They all listened for the sound of it hitting bottom. No sound came. Martinson's expression faltered slightly. Must be deeper than it looks, he muttered, though his confident tone had evaporated. Meredith finished preparing the camera and carefully lowered it into the darkness. The monitor connected to it showed normal footage until the camera crossed the boundary, then nothing but static. Equipment malfunction, one of the workers suggested hopefully. Let's try something else, Meredith said, retrieving the camera and checking that it still functioned properly outside the circle. Next, she tied a simple metal weight to a length of bright yellow cord and began lowering it into the darkness, marking the cord at 1-foot intervals to measure depth. The cord continued to descend. 10 feet, 20, 50, 100, far deeper than seemed possible, given the topography of the area. At 200 feet, with no end in sight, and no tension to suggest the weight had hit bottom, Meredith began to draw the cord back up. It came up smoothly until it reached the boundary of the circle, then suddenly went slack in her hands. When she pulled the final length out, the end was cleanly severed, as if cut with a sharp blade. The weight was gone. A heavy silence fell over the group as they all stared at the cut cord. Even Sheriff Martinson seemed at a loss for words. I think, Meredith said finally, we should continue this investigation with more specialized equipment, and perhaps wait until daylight is stronger. No one disagreed. By late afternoon, the excavation site had been transformed into something resembling a scientific research station. Additional experts had been called in: a geophysicist from the State University, a representative from the Bureau of Land Management, even a paranormal investigator, whom Cavanaugh had insisted on including despite the sheriff's objections. Various instruments surrounded the dark circle: seismographs, atmospheric monitors, radiation detectors, thermal cameras. All of them registered anomalous readings at the boundary of the circle, and none could provide data from within it. The most disturbing development came when the thermal cameras detected what appeared to be heat signatures moving within the darkness, multiple amorphous shapes that shifted and merged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Those could be anything, the geophysicist argued: thermal distortions, equipment errors, or they could be exactly what they looked like, the paranormal investigator countered. Living entities within whatever space exists beyond that boundary. Sheriff Martinson had gone from skeptical to deeply uncomfortable as the day progressed, and the evidence mounted that they were dealing with something well beyond normal experience. I'm calling in the state police, he announced after the heat signatures were discovered, and possibly the FBI. This is beyond our jurisdiction. Meredith, who had been studying Harmon's journal more closely during breaks in the investigation, approached Cavanaugh with a troubled expression. I have been comparing dates, she said quietly, ensuring they weren't overheard. If the 11-year cycle Harmon documented is consistent, the next event would be due this year. Cavanaugh nodded grimly. I have made the same calculation. That's part of why I was searching this area to begin with. I thought if I could find evidence of what really happened to the Kesslers, maybe we could prevent it from happening again. But according to Harmon's final entry, he believed he had found a way to end the cycle. Meredith glanced toward the circle of darkness. What if that's what this is? What if he somehow changed things when he went in there? You think he went in voluntarily? Cavanaugh asked, though his tone suggested he had already considered this possibility. The price is my life, Meredith quoted from the journal. I think he sacrificed himself, hoping it would break the cycle. But without knowing what he discovered, What he understood at the end, we can't be sure if he succeeded. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the clearing. One of the workers was shouting, pointing toward the forest. Everyone turned to look. A figure stood among the trees, partially obscured by shadows but clearly watching the excavation site. It appeared to be a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit. "Hey," Sheriff Martinson called out, starting toward the figure. "This is a restricted area." The figure didn't move or respond. As Martinson approached, flashlight beam extended before him. The stranger seemed to recede further into the trees without actually taking any steps backward, as if the distance between them was expanding independently of movement. I said stop. Martinson drew his weapon, quickening his pace. The figure finally moved, raising a hand in what could have been either a greeting or a warning. Even from a distance, Meredith could see that the hand was incomplete, missing 2 fingers. "Gerald Fisher," she whispered, remembering the description from Harmon's journal. But that was impossible. Fisher would be well over 100 years old by now, if he had survived at all. And something about the figure seemed wrong: too tall, too still, proportions slightly off in a way that triggered an instinctive unease. Sheriff Martinson had reached the edge of the trees, but stopped abruptly, as if hitting an invisible barrier. He staggered back, disoriented. What the hell? The figure lowered its hand and turned, moving deeper into the forest with an unnatural fluidity, like a shadow flowing rather than a person walking. After him, Martinson ordered 2 of his deputies, who hesitated only briefly before pursuing the stranger into the trees. Meredith felt a cold certainty that they wouldn't find anything. The figure, whatever it was, had appeared for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with being caught. Her suspicion was confirmed minutes later when the deputies returned, breathless and confused, reporting that the stranger had vanished completely in a section of forest with no obvious hiding places or escape routes. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Meredith noticed something that sent a chill through her. The circle of darkness at the center of the excavation seemed to be breathing, expanding slightly and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pattern that matched the pulse of the heat signatures within it. "It's responding to the darkness," she realized aloud. "It's becoming more active as night approaches." The paranormal investigator had noticed the same phenomenon. "We should establish a perimeter," he advised urgently. "No one should get close to that thing after dark." Sheriff Martinson, still rattled from his experience at the forest's edge, didn't argue. He ordered floodlights set up around the excavation site and positioned his deputies at regular intervals around the circle, with strict instructions not to approach it under any circumstances. As true night fell, the transformation of the circle accelerated. The darkness deepened, if such a thing were possible, taking on an almost viscous quality at its edges. The heat signatures within it grew more numerous and more defined, some now distinctly humanoid in shape. And then came the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible even in the hushed silence that had fallen over the site. Fragments of words, snippets of conversation, childish laughter that raised goosebumps on Meredith's arms. "Is someone recording this?" she asked, not taking her eyes from the circle. The paranormal investigator nodded, indicating sophisticated audio equipment that was already running. "We are getting everything." The whispers grew louder, more distinct, resolving into recognizable words. "Home now. Forest keeps. Freely given. The cycle ends." And then, rising above the others, a child's voice, clear and sweet and terrible in its innocence. "Mommy, Daddy, you found us." One of the deputies, a young woman positioned closest to the circle, gasped and took an involuntary step forward. "Wren?" she whispered incredulously. Meredith turned to her sharply. "You recognize that voice?" The deputy's face had gone pale. "My grandmother had recordings of the Kessler children, family videos she'd converted to digital. She was their aunt. Eleanor Kessler was her sister. That voice, That's Wren Kessler. But she'd be, what, 47 now? That's a child's voice. A new voice emerged from the darkness, deeper, adult and hauntingly familiar to Meredith after hours of reading his journal. It's too late. I tried to end it, but I only made it stronger. Now it's breaking free. Elias Harmon, Cavanaugh confirmed quietly, coming to stand beside Meredith. I heard recordings of his testimony during the original investigation. The circle of darkness pulsed violently, expanding several inches beyond its previous boundary before contracting again. Several people scrambled backward, including Sheriff Martinson, who was now openly pale and sweating despite the cool night air. "We need to seal this thing," Martinson declared, his voice cracking slightly. "Concrete, steel, whatever it takes. No one else goes near it." "That won't work," the voice of Harmon said, as if responding directly to the sheriff. "It's awake now. It's hungry, and it's learned." "Learned what?" Meredith called out, unable to contain her scientific curiosity despite the growing dread in her stomach. A different voice answered, older, raspier, with a cruel edge that made several listeners flinch. "Learned to take without permission." With those words, the circle expanded explosively, doubling in size in an instant. Two workers who had been standing too close screamed as their legs were engulfed by the darkness. They fell forward, clawing desperately at the ground as they were dragged inward. "Help!" one cried, managing to halt his progress momentarily by gripping a root protruding from the earth. "For God's sake, help me!" Several people rushed forward, including Cavanaugh, who grabbed the man's outstretched hands and pulled with all his might. For a moment, it seemed he might succeed. The man's body moved slightly away from the expanding darkness. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the darkness surged upward, engulfing both the trapped workers and Cavanaugh in a heartbeat. Their screams cut off abruptly, leaving only a terrible silence. "Everyone back!" Meredith shouted, already retreating herself. "Get to the vehicles." The remaining personnel didn't need to be told twice. They fled in a panic toward the edge of the clearing, where their vehicles were parked, the circle of darkness continuing to expand behind them, swallowing equipment, trees, earth, everything in its path. Meredith reached her rental car and fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking too badly to insert them properly. Sheriff Martinson was nearby, practically throwing deputies into cruisers while shouting into his radio for backup. As Meredith finally got her door open, a sound from behind made her turn. The darkness had stopped expanding about 50 feet away, forming a perfect hemisphere that encompassed most of the excavation site. And standing at its edge, as if they had just stepped through its surface, were 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, dressed in the fashion of the mid-1980s, their faces eerily calm and expressionless. "The Kesslers," Meredith breathed, recognizing them from the photographs in the case file. They looked exactly as they had in 1986. Thad, 17, Linnea, 15, Quentin, 13, and Wren, 9. Completely unchanged after nearly 4 decades. Behind them emerged 2 adults, Eleanor and Marcus Kessler, also unchanged, also expressionless. And then more figures, emerging in pairs or groups, children and adults from different eras, recognizable from photographs in Harmon's journal as the victims of previous cycles. The Hammonds from the Whittakers from 1976. Dozens of others, stretching back through the decades. All of them stood in perfect stillness at the edge of the darkness, watching the terrified survivors with eyes that reflected no light. Sheriff Martinson had frozen beside his cruiser, gun drawn but hanging uselessly at his side as he stared at the impossible assembly. "What the hell are you?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely audible. The figures remained silent for a long moment. Then, as one, they smiled, identical, 2 wide smiles that stretched their faces in ways human faces were never meant to stretch. "We are what was freely given," they said in perfect unison, their voices overlapping in a discordant chorus. We are what the forest kept. And now, a new voice added. As a final figure emerged from the darkness, Gerald Fisher, or what had once been Gerald Fisher, his form elongated and distorted just as Harmon had described in his journal. We are what the forest returned. With those words, the assembled figures began to move forward, spreading out in a wide semicircle to surround the few remaining humans. Their movements were wrong, too fluid, too synchronized, like puppets controlled by a single hand. The vehicles won't help you, Fisher's distorted voice continued conversationally. The forest extends far beyond these trees now. It has grown hungry during the long wait. Meredith, her scientific mind still functioning despite her terror, seized on his words. The wait? You mean the cycle? The 11 years between takings? Fisher's misshapen head tilted curiously. The detective tried to break the cycle, offered himself instead of the next family. Such noble sacrifice. His face stretched into that terrible smile again. It was exactly what we needed, a keeper freely given. His power sustains the gateway now, keeps it open permanently. So instead of taking one family every 11 years, Meredith realized with dawning horror, you can now take anyone, everyone. The forest keeps what is freely given, the chorus of former victims intoned. And soon, all will be freely given. Sheriff Martinson finally broke from his paralysis, raising his gun and firing at the nearest figure, what had once been Thad Kessler. The bullets passed through the boy without effect, not even disturbing his clothing. We are beyond such things now, Fisher said, almost pityingly. We are of the forest, and the forest is of us. The figures continued their advance, unhurried but relentless. Meredith looked frantically around the clearing, searching for any means of escape, any weakness in the encircling line. Her eyes fell on Harmon's journal, which she had placed on the passenger seat of her car. A desperate idea formed. If Harmon had found a way to change the cycle once, perhaps his full journal contained information that could help them now. She dove into the car, snatching up the journal and flipping rapidly through the pages, searching for anything that might offer a clue. The final entries were her focus. What had Harmon discovered at the end? What had he understood about the true nature of the gateway? Behind her, screams erupted as the figures reached the first of the fleeing humans, a deputy who had tripped while running for the cruisers. The former Kessler children surrounded him, their hands now elongated into something more like claws reaching for him in perfect synchronicity. Meredith blocked out the sounds, forcing herself to focus on the journal. The last dated entry she had already read, but there was something else, a folded paper tucked into the very back of the book, hidden in a small pocket in the binding. With trembling fingers, she extracted it and unfolded a hand-drawn map of Whispering Pines Forest. At its center was the cabin, marked with the gateway symbol. But there were other markings too, 7 points arranged in a perfect circle around the cabin, each labeled with a different symbol. And at the bottom of the map, in Harmon's handwriting, the binding points. If the gateway opens fully, destroy these in sequence, counterclockwise from the north point. The forest will consume itself. Meredith looked up from the map to see that only she and Sheriff Martinson remained free, the others having been overtaken by the advancing figures, and those figures were now turning toward them, their movements becoming more eager, more predatory. "Sheriff," she called, holding up the map. "We need to find these locations." Martinson glanced at the map, then back at the approaching horde, clearly torn between flight and this slim chance at salvation. "How?" "There's no time." Meredith studied the map again, noting that each binding point was marked with precise coordinates. "Do you have GPS on your phone?" Martinson nodded, pulling out his device. "But we'd need to split up. There's 7 points and only 2 of us. We only need the first one to start the sequence," Meredith realized, quickly finding the northernmost point on the map. Here, about half a mile north of the cabin. The figures were closing in now, barely 20 yards away. Fisher at their center, his distorted form seeming to grow larger, more imposing with each step. "What are we looking for when we get there?" Martinson demanded, already backing toward the forest's edge, guns still uselessly in hand. Meredith shook her head, frustrated. "The map doesn't say, just destroy the binding points. We will have to figure it out when we find it." With no better option, they turned and ran into the forest, away from the advancing figures and toward what they hoped was salvation. Behind them, Fisher's laughter echoed unnaturally among the trees, and the many voices of his followers joined in a chorus that seemed to come from the forest itself. "Run, run, as fast as you can. The forest keeps what is freely given, and you have given yourselves freely by entering its domain." They ran through the darkened forest, guided only by the flashlight on Martinson's phone and the GPS coordinates of the first binding point. The voices followed them, sometimes seeming to come from directly beside them, or even from the trees themselves. Occasionally they caught glimpses of figures moving parallel to their path, the unchanged victims of decades past, flowing through the forest like shadows given substance. "They are herding us," Martinson gasped as they paused briefly to check their position. "Driving us deeper into the forest instead of toward town." "We are almost there," Meredith replied, checking the coordinates. "Less than 100 yards now." They pressed on, the forest growing denser, older, the trees so massive and ancient they seemed to belong to a different era. The ground beneath their feet changed to no longer the soft carpet of pine needles, but hard-packed earth inscribed with faint patterns that caught the light of their flash in unsettling ways. "There!" Martinson pointed ahead to where the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing. At its center stood a stone, not a natural boulder, but a deliberately placed monolith about 4 feet tall, covered in carvings similar to the gateway symbol but more complex, more elaborate. "That has to be it," Meredith said, approaching the stone cautiously. "One of the binding points." As they drew closer, they could see that the stone was not a solid piece, but composed of smaller, interlocking blocks, fitted together with remarkable precision. And embedded in its center, visible through a small opening, was something that glowed with a faint blue light. "How do we destroy it?" Martinson wondered, circling the stone. "We don't have any tools." Before Meredith could respond, a voice spoke from the darkness surrounding the clearing. "You don't." They turned to see Gerald Fisher standing at the edge of the trees, his distorted form silhouetted against the deeper blackness beyond. He was alone, the other figures nowhere to be seen. "The binding stones were set by the original keepers," Fisher continued, his voice no longer fully human. "They don't contain the forest, they contain what lives beneath it. What has always lived there, feeding and growing, waiting for the day when it would be strong enough to break free." And Harmon gave it that strength, Meredith realized. By offering himself voluntarily, he changed the rules somehow. Fisher's misshapen head bobbed in what might have been a nod. The detective thought he was being clever, substituting himself for the family that was due to be taken. But he didn't understand the true nature of the cycle. It was never about the taking, it was about the timing. The forest needs power at specific intervals to maintain the binding. By offering himself out of sequence, he disrupted the pattern. "So the binding is already weakening," Meredith concluded, glancing at the stone. "That's why you can leave the gateway now, why you are able to take more than just one family." "Very good, Doctor." Fisher's voice had taken on an almost teasing quality, but still not quite right. "The binding isn't weakening, it's transforming, becoming a conduit rather than a constraint. Soon the forest will extend beyond these physical boundaries, beyond this town, this state, this world." As if to illustrate his point, the trees surrounding the clearing began to shift, their forms becoming fluid, branches extending and merging until they formed a living wall of vegetation that completely encircled the clearing. "You are too late," Fisher said, spreading his elongated arms wide. "The process has already begun. By dawn, the gateway will be fully open, and what waits beyond will emerge completely into your world." Sheriff Martinson had heard enough. With a desperate cry, he charged toward the stone monolith, apparently intending to try to topple it by sheer force. Before he could reach it, the ground beneath his feet erupted, roots and vines shooting upward to ensnare his legs and arms, pulling him to a halt mere feet from his goal. "The forest protects its own," Fisher observed mildly. But Martinson's action had given Meredith an idea. While Fisher's attention was on the struggling sheriff, she carefully reached into her pocket, feeling for the stone Cavanaugh had given her, the one found with Harmon's journal, bearing the gateway symbol. "What about Harmon?" she called to Fisher, trying to keep him distracted. "You said he's sustaining the gateway now. What exactly does that mean?" Fisher's attention shifted to her, his distorted face impossible to read. "The detective, he is everywhere and nowhere. Part of the forest, part of what lies beyond. His consciousness persists, in a way a thread of humanity woven into the fabric of something far greater and more terrible. And the children, the families taken over the decades, are they the same?" "They are transformed," Fisher replied, his voice taking on an almost reverent quality. "Neither alive nor dead, as you understand such concepts. They have become vessels, masks worn by what dwells beyond the gateway, useful for interacting with your world until the full emergence is complete." While they spoke, Meredith had been slowly moving closer to the stone monolith, the gateway stone concealed in her palm. Something Harmon had written in his journal nagged at her memory. Something about symbols and counter-symbols, about how the gateway sign could both open and close depending on orientation. "And what about you, Mr. Fisher?" she pressed, now just a few feet from the monolith. "Are you also just a mask, a vessel for something else?" Fisher's form seemed to flicker, momentarily revealing something beneath the human-like exterior, something composed of angles and proportions that made Meredith's mind recoil in instinctive horror. "I am the first," he said, his voice now overlaid with other voices, deeper and more alien. "The original keeper who discovered the truth beneath the forest. I made the first offering my own family, and in return, I was granted continuation." Meredith was close enough now to see that the blue glow within the monolith came from a small crystal embedded at its center, visible through a narrow opening in the interlocking stones. Without giving herself time to reconsider, she thrust her hand forward, pushing the gateway stone Harmon had left directly into contact with the crystal. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. A blinding light erupted from the monolith, accompanied by a sound that was less a noise than a physical force, a vibration that seemed to resonate at a frequency specifically designed to cause pain to human ears. Fisher screamed, his form contorting even further as the light touched him. The living wall of vegetation surrounding the clearing began to wither and blacken, the trees collapsing inward as if suddenly drained of all life and substance. The vines holding Martinson released their grip, retreating into the ground as the sheriff fell forward, hands covering his ears against the terrible sound. "What did you do?" he shouted to Meredith, though she could barely hear him over the resonant howl emanating from the monolith. "Counter-symbol," she shouted back, backing away from the stone as cracks began to appear in its surface. Harmon figured it out. The binding points can be reversed. The monolith was now visibly disintegrating, the interlocking stones separating as the crystal at its center pulsed with increasingly erratic bursts of blue light. Where Fisher had stood was now only a writhing mass of darkness, its form constantly shifting as if struggling to maintain cohesion. "We need to get to the next point." Meredith grabbed Martinson's arm, pulling him to his feet. Counterclockwise from north, they fled the clearing as the monolith finally collapsed entirely, the explosion of light and sound behind them momentarily illuminating the entire forest in an unearthly blue glow. The screams that followed seemed to come from everywhere at once, not just Fisher's voice, but dozens, hundreds of voices unified in a chorus of rage and pain. The journey to the remaining binding points became a nightmarish race against time and an increasingly unstable reality. As they destroyed each monolith using the same technique, finding the crystal center and countering it with Harmon's stone, the forest around them began to unravel. Trees melted into mist, solid ground became treacherous and unpredictable, and gravity itself seemed to waver in certain areas, forcing them to cling to whatever stable surfaces they could find, to avoid being pulled into suddenly appearing voids. The figures that had emerged from the gateway were everywhere now, their forms increasingly unstable, sometimes appearing as the people they had once been, sometimes as horrifying amalgamations of human and something else entirely. They pursued Meredith and Martinson relentlessly, but seemed unable to approach the binding points directly, held at bay by some aspect of the ancient magic that had created them. After destroying the sixth monolith, they paused momentarily, both exhausted and disoriented by the chaotic landscape around them. The forest was now barely recognizable as such, more a swirling maelstrom of matter and energy that occasionally coalesced into recognizable forms before dissolving again. "One more," Meredith gasped, checking the map with shaking hands. "The western point. Then the sequence is complete." Martinson nodded grimly, his face streaked with dirt and blood from a dozen minor injuries sustained during their desperate journey. "And then what? What happens when all seven are destroyed?" According to Harmon's notes, the forest consumes itself. The gateway collapses. Meredith hesitated, then added what she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "But we might be consumed with it. We are deep inside the affected area now." Martinson managed a grim smile. "Better than the alternative. You saw what those things were becoming." They pressed on toward the final binding point, moving as quickly as they dared through the disintegrating landscape. Twice they nearly fell into suddenly appearing chasms, and once they were forced to hide as a group of former victims passed nearby, their forms now so distorted they resembled walking collections of forest debris given horrifying semblance of human shape. The final monolith stood in what had once been a small hollow, but was now the center of a slowly rotating vortex of earth and vegetation. The stone itself remained stable, anchored to some deeper reality beneath the chaos surrounding it. As they approached, a figure materialized before them, Elias Harmon, or what remained of him. Unlike the other victims, his form was more stable, more human, though his eyes glowed with the same blue light as the crystals within the monoliths. "You found my journal," he said, his voice surprisingly normal. "You understood." "Not everything," Meredith admitted, "but enough to know the binding points needed to be destroyed in sequence." Harmon nodded, his gaze shifting to the final monolith. "I couldn't do it myself. Once I entered the gateway, I became part of its system. But I could leave the tools for someone else to find." "What happens when we destroy the last one?" Martinson demanded. "Do we die along with everything else here?" Harmon's expression was solemn. "I don't know. This has never been done before. But whatever happens, it will be better than allowing the gateway to fully open." He gestured around at the dissolving reality. "This is just the beginning. What waits on the other side would consume your entire world, not just this forest." A chorus of inhuman screams erupted behind them. The former victims, led by the twisted remains of Gerald Fisher, had found them. They were converging on the hollow from all directions, moving with desperate speed. "Now," Harmon urged, "before they stop you." Meredith ran to the final monolith, Martinson close behind. This one was different from the others, larger, more elaborately carved, the crystal at its center pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat. As she prepared to place Harmon's stone against it, she hesitated. "Will this free them? The victims?" Harmon's glowing eyes softened slightly. "Yes. One way or another, they will be released from what they have become." That was enough. Meredith pressed the stone into the opening, making contact with the crystal within. The reaction dwarfed all previous destructions. The monolith didn't just crack or collapse, it exploded outward with the force of a bomb, knocking Meredith and Martinson off their feet. The blue light became a solid pillar, shooting upward into the chaotic sky. where it spread outward like ripples in a pond. Where the light touched, reality seemed to stabilize momentarily before disintegrating completely. Trees, earth, the pursuing figures of former victims, all dissolving into particles that were drawn upward into the spreading light. "It's working," Meredith shouted over the deafening roar that accompanied the destruction. "The gateway is closing." Harmon's form had begun to disintegrate as well, particles of his being drawn into the expanding wave of blue energy. But he was smiling, an expression of peace replacing the solemn determination of moments before. "The cycle ends," he said, his voice already fading. "Thank you." The dissolution accelerated, the vortex of destruction expanding outward at an exponential rate. Meredith and Martinson found themselves at the center of a rapidly shrinking island of stability, as everything around them was consumed. "I don't think we are going to make it out of here," Martinson said, surprisingly calm as he watched their safe zone contract by the second. "No," Meredith agreed, equally composed in the face of what seemed inevitable. "But we completed the sequence. Whatever was trying to come through won't succeed." As the edge of the dissolution reached their feet, Meredith closed her eyes, preparing for whatever would come next. She felt a strange tingling sensation, then a sensation of falling, or perhaps flying. Directional concepts seemed to lose meaning, as the world around her ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Her last conscious thought was of Harmon's journal, of the decades of research and sacrifice that had led to this moment. At least the cycle was broken. At least no more families would vanish into the hungry forest. Then everything, including thought itself, dissolved into light. Oakhollow, Washington, April 17, 2024. Still no explanation for the unprecedented geological event that occurred in Whispering Pines State Forest nearly a month ago, the news anchor was saying, her professionally concerned expression filling the television screen in Oakhollow's only diner. Scientists continued to study the massive sinkhole that appeared overnight, consuming nearly 3 square miles of forest land. The camera cut to aerial footage of an enormous crater where a significant portion of Whispering Pines had once stood. Teams of researchers in hazmat suits could be seen taking samples at its edges, while construction equipment stood ready to begin whatever containment measures would eventually be implemented. Authorities maintained that the sinkhole was caused by the collapse of an extensive network of abandoned mining tunnels beneath the forest. The anchor continued. However, conspiracy theories continue to circulate online, fueled by reports of strange lights and unexplained phenomena witnessed by local residents prior to the collapse. The television's volume was abruptly lowered as a waitress approached the solitary customer. Seated at the counter, a woman in her early 40s with short, dark hair and a haunted expression. "More coffee, ma'am?" the waitress asked, coffee pot already poised. Dr. Meredith Chen nodded, pushing her cup forward. "Thank you. You are one of the scientists studying the sinkhole, aren't you? I have seen you with the research teams." Meredith hesitated before answering. "Yes, I'm part of the investigation." "Find anything interesting yet?" "Nothing conclusive," Meredith replied carefully, the lie now practiced and smooth. How could she explain what they had actually found, or rather, what they hadn't found? No bodies, no remains of the cabin, no trace of the monoliths or the gateway. Just a perfectly circular crater with soil composition that defied conventional analysis and radiation readings that fluctuated in patterns that matched no known radioactive element. And no Sheriff Martinson either, though Meredith had somehow been found unconscious at the edge of the crater, with no memory of how she had escaped the destruction. The official explanation was that she had been thrown clear by the force of the initial collapse. But she knew better. Something or someone had saved her. Perhaps Harmon, in his final moments of existence. "Well, I hope they figure it out soon," the waitress said, interrupting Meredith's thoughts. "It's bad for tourism, having a giant hole where our famous forest used to be." "I'm sure they will," Meredith assured her, though she knew the truth would never be made public, even if they did determine it conclusively. As the waitress moved away, Meredith's phone vibrated with an incoming text. It was from David Cavanaugh's daughter, who had been helping her sort through her father's papers following his disappearance during the geological event. "Found something you should see," the message read. "Old photo album with pictures of my grandfather and someone named Harmon, and a journal dated 1944-1954. Mentions the cycle and the forest's hunger." Meredith stared at the message, a chill running through her despite the warm spring day. 1944, the year Harmon had noted as an anomaly, when no children were taken and illness had swept through Oakhollow instead. And suddenly she understood what Fisher had meant about the binding not weakening but transforming. What if they hadn't ended the cycle but merely changed it again? What if the forest's hunger, the gateway, the entity beyond whatever it truly was, couldn't be destroyed, only redirected? She thought of the crater, of the teams studying it, of the strange readings they couldn't explain. What if they were inadvertently creating a new gateway, a new means for whatever waited beyond to eventually return? "The cycle ends," Harmon had said in his final moments. But what if cycles, by their very nature, never truly ended? What if they just changed form, adapted, evolved? Meredith finished her coffee and left money on the counter. She had work to do, papers to read, patterns to identify, warnings to prepare. Because if she was right, they might have won a battle but not the war. The forest was gone, but what had lived beneath it might still be waiting, patient as only ancient things can be, for a new door to open, for a new cycle to begin.